name is Stephen Kirchner and I'm the Program Director for Trade and Investment at the United States Study Centre. Today I'm joined by Scott Sumner, the Ralph G. Hawtrey Chair of Monetary Policy at the MIDAS Centre at George Mason University. Scott is perhaps best known for his blog, themoneyillusion.com, which he started in response to the global financial crisis in 2009. He's the author of the MIDAS Paradox, Financial Markets, Government Policy Shocks, and the Great Depression, probably one of the best economic histories of the Depression of the 1930s. He's also author with Stephen Rubb of Economic Principles, A Business Perspective, published in 2019. Thanks for joining us today, Scott.
Thanks for inviting me, Stephen.
Let me begin on a personal note. The MIDAS Centre is based in Arlington, Virginia, but you live and work in the greater Los Angeles area. Speaking of the effort to suppress the pandemic in LA and California more generally, and how is this affecting you on a day-to-day basis?
You know, for me, it has actually been that difficult because I've been working out of my house basically for years. So now many people are switching to this kind of work, but for me, it's something I've already been doing for quite some time. So I can't say there's really been any great hardship other than cancellation of the NBA season, but otherwise we're doing fine here.
You indicated on your blog the other day that you thought California had a slightly better handle on the pandemic than other states.
That's right. The data shows we're doing somewhat better. Now, it's hard to know why. I think we started the social distancing a little bit earlier, but it could be the mild weather here helps a little bit relative to, say, New York City. And it's a little bit less dense, too. It's kind of wide open, very open, unlike New York.
Yeah. Turning to the subject for which you're best known, monetary policy, Dornbush famously said that none of the post-war expansions in the US died of old age. They were murdered by the Fed. You are also an advocate of the monetary view of business cycles. This time is obviously different in that the downturn we're seeing has not been induced by monetary policy. The pandemic is more of a real shock. How do you see the role of monetary policy in this crisis? And do you think the Fed is doing enough this time?
Well, you're right. It isn't a typical monetary type of recession. And certainly at the moment, monetary policy doesn't have much to do with the employment market and the broader situation. But I think monetary policy is always important, even when you have a real shock hitting the economy. First of all, if monetary policy is off course, the worse than it really needs to be. But my focus is basically on the recovery. It has to do enough to ensure that we have a robust recovery once workers are able to go back to work. And you think, well, it's obvious once they take these restrictions off, they bounce back. But in fact, the financial markets show that's not all. Many indicators suggest, for instance, that inflation will remain very low over the next few years, well below the 2% target. So I think actually the Fed needs to do a little bit more monetary stimulus, even though that problem of loss of jobs. It's more to ensure that the demand is there as workers are able to go back to work at some point in the future.
So your concern would mainly be about how supportive monetary policy is during the recovery, which I think was one of your criticisms of the Fed's response to the global financial crisis in 2008, that not only was the Fed slow out of the gate in response to the crisis, but that monetary policy was too tight in its aftermath.
Exactly. No reason for a shock like this to produce a very long recession, assuming we can have the medical clearance to get workers back to work at some point. And I'm certainly no expert on that. I would guess that we'll have a bad month or two and then probably sort of gradually reopen the economy in stages, bringing back workers first in certain sectors and then later in other sectors. So you may have a very bad second quarter and then growth in the third and fourth. And once we get to that growth phase, that's where monetary policy is essential. There has to be the demand there for workers to be rehired once they're able to go back to work.
So do you think the Fed was quicker off the mark in response to the pandemic than it was to the financial crisis in 2008? We've seen 700 billion in quantitative easing straight out of the gate. The response at least seems to be a bit more timely this time.
It clearly was quicker, but that's partly to be expected given the nature of this shock was so much more dramatic, and it was very clear what was going wrong right off the bat. I think in 2008, even in the middle of the year, the Fed was still worried about high inflation, for instance. So diagnosing the problem was a little bit more difficult in 2008. But nevertheless, even though the Fed has been very aggressive, being aggressive is one thing, but doing the right thing is something else. And I do think there's still some missed opportunity here, things that could be done differently that would improve things. So I certainly can't criticize the Fed for not being very aggressive, and certainly the Fed has helped the situation with some of these moves, but I still think a few opportunities that could be pursued. And again, that would sort of help ensure that the recovery is strong once it begins.
You're also well known for promoting the idea of monetary offset, sometimes called the Sumner critique, which says that if the central bank is doing its job properly, there's no effective role for fiscal policy in stabilizing aggregate demand. What do you see as the role of fiscal policy in the current situation? Is fiscal policy or monetary offset still relevant?
I think it's still relevant to some extent. Ironically, the same problem monetary policy has is also fiscal policy. Pumping money into the economy won't immediately bring workers back to work. So we have to think very clearly about what we're trying to do with these policy tools. The way I look at fiscal policy is one theme is called fiscal stimulus. That's where the policy is used explicitly about spending more aggregate demand in the economy. So let's call it fiscal stimulus. Another use of fiscal policy is to provide relief for certain sectors of the economy, particularly the unemployed, workers, small businesses going out of business. In my view, fiscal policy should not focus on promoting more aggregate demand. I would prefer monetary policy do that. So in that sense, I'm really in favor of fiscal stimulus. At the same time, I do think it's inevitable we need to spend more in this crisis. The deficit does need to get larger. We need to have more unemployment compensation and other related programs to deal with the stress of this crisis. So if you do fiscal policy that way, yes, we need to do quite a bit. But if you define it as a tool explicitly to promote more aggregate demand, I'd rather leave that to monetary policy.
Sure. Do you think monetary offset becomes more relevant as we move into the recovery?
Right, so it's really hard to know ever, even in retrospect, what a counterfactual would have been. Like if we hadn't done fiscal stimulus, would they do more monetary stimulus? But when I look at the record over the last 15 years or so, I see a number of fiscal actions by the federal government that certainly look like they didn't have much effect. The 2008 tax cut, the 2009 stimulus, and then the austerity that was quite severe in 2013 in the US, where the economy actually sped up because monetary stimulus was pursued at the same time as fiscal austerity. And then finally, around 2017 and 18, there was a lot of fiscal stimulus, but the Fed raised interest rates 9 times during from 2015 to 2019. So there's a lot of evidence in favor of monetary offset. I wouldn't argue it's exactly one for one. It would vary from one situation to another. But the other point I would make is monetary policy is more efficient, it's less costly. So if you're thinking of the two tools, why not use each one for what it's best at? Monetary policy for controlling total spending, fiscal for problems that can only be addressed through fiscal, such as employment compensation programs and other related activities.
Certainly in terms of speed of response, I think monetary policy has a huge advantage over fiscal policy. Both in the US and Australia, we've seen significant delays in rolling out fiscal stimulus, whereas monetary policy has been able to respond very quickly. is also very comprehensive in terms of the scope of its effect.
Yeah, no, a lot of concern about the running out of ammunition, but recently the Fed has made it very clear that they're not in danger of running out of ammunition, and they've consistently expanded their horizons in terms of like what assets they're willing to buy in order to inject money in the economy. So whenever they seem to run up against any sort of potential barrier, they come up with new ideas, new programs. And, you know, in a technical sense, there's obviously no limit on how much money a central bank can create. Any limits that exist in the real world are political, and those may be important in certain situations like the Eurozone, where there's difficult political problems in, you know, implementing ECB policy, but the problems are clearly political, where central banks are not doing enough. They're not technical. There's no limit in how much money a central bank can.
You have just released a paper with the MIDAS Center, Reforming the Fed's Toolkit and Quantitative Easing Practices, a plan to achieve level targeting. Can you outline firstly what you mean by level targeting and what are you proposing in that paper?
Okay, one interesting thing about that paper is we worked on it for a fairly short period, but even during that short period, things were changing rapidly. So some of the items on our list, like reserve requirements, they were abolished while we were working on the paper last month. Interest on reserves was to only 0.1%. We had advocated abolishing interest on reserves. We advocated sort of unlimited ability to QE, and last month Congress gave the Fed essentially implicitly a lot more authority to do a lot more QE, some fiscal backstops in case the Fed loses money. But you're right, level targeting was the key element in that paper. I strongly feel that level targeting is the single most important thing the Fed can do to make a decisive difference in policy. And what that means is that instead of just having, say, a 2% inflation target and then continually targeting inflation over at that each year, even if you miss, with level targeting, you set a path for the price level, like a line on a graph that goes up at 2% a year, and you to come back to that trend line if you under or overshoot. So you want prices to be 2% higher after 1 year, 4% after 2, 6% after 3, a little bit with compounding, but basically that's the idea. If we had level targeting in the past, it would have been more aggressive because mostly the undershot, for the most part, the inflation target over the last decade. With level targeting, it allows the Fed to be aggressive, and that'll tend to raise inflation expectations when you're in a recession because the markets know the Fed can do more to try to get back to that trend line. And as a result, a lot of economists that work with technical models feel level targeting is much more robust when you're at zero interest rates. It sort of gives the monetary policy traction, ability to really impact the economy in a much more aggressive way than inflation rate targeting does. So we've strongly advocated that they switch to level targeting. The other people like Ben Bernanke have talked about this. And the Fed is currently undertaking a fairly long review of its policy approach. And in this review, they are considering as close to level targeting. Another related one is called average inflation targeting, to sort of target the average inflation rate over a number of years. So they're aware of this problem, and we're sort of nudging them or encouraging them to move more aggressively because I believe in this crisis, a switch to level targeting would immediately improve expectations and would help the credit markets as a side effect.
Before the pandemic hit, you were somewhat optimistic that there was a growing intellectual shift in favour of nominal GDP level targeting, both within and outside the Fed. Are you still optimistic that this will occur, or has the pandemic derailed that for the moment?
No, I think I feel about the same. I certainly never expected it to happen overnight because the Fed has a lot of sort of credibility capital invested in inflation targeting. So I see this as something that's probably going to happen in stages. And when I think of my general approach, there's probably sort of three key components. There's nominal GDP level targeting, which itself has two components: switching from inflation to nominal GDP and switching from growth rate to level targeting. And then the third is a, quote, whatever it takes approach. So this would be a commitment by the central bank to do whatever it takes, that is, do as much QE as necessary to expect it to hit its target. And if you think of those three components, I think we're making actually more progress on the level targeting and the whatever it takes parts of the program than the NGDP. So I think the nominal GDP will come last. I think the level targeting will happen this decade, maybe in stages. And in terms of whatever it takes, I think the Fed is already pretty close to that. They're using some of that language in recent statements. A willingness to buy as many assets as required and to go beyond the traditional assets such as treasury bonds and buy a wider range of assets if necessary. And that was one of the proposals in the paper that the Fed go to Congress and just try to make explicit what I think is already implicit, that the Fed has unlimited ammunition. That Congress would understand that in an emergency, if necessary to achieve its target, to achieve its mandate, it will buy as many assets as necessary to do so.
There has been some discussion of nominal income targeting in Australia as well, although I think the RBA would still need a lot of convincing to bring them on board.
Well, and I'm not even sure that Australia is the best country to go first on that. I think it would work okay in Australia. One of the things I've argued is that nominal GDP is probably not the perfect target. For the United States, it may not make much difference, but for countries that are large commodity exporters, you could argue that something like full labor compensation, which is often about 2/3 of GDP, might be a better target because if there are large swings in the price of a commodity that you export, that kind of distort nominal GDP. The thought experiment I always use is to take a country like Kuwait. If the price of oil doubled, it would be pretty hard to stabilize nominal GDP in Kuwait without shrinking the non-oil sector of the Kuwaiti economy very sharply. For the US, which is very diversified and where commodities are a share of GDP, that distinction doesn't matter very much. It matters a little bit more in Australia, and I'm not quite sure how much it matters there. But it's at least something to think about.
Yeah, I think the thinking in Australia is that if we were to adopt a form of nominal income targeting, it wouldn't be for GDP as such, but a component of GDP that strips out the effect of import and export prices. So for example, target gross national expenditure or nominal private demand instead.
Yeah, good point.
Some commentators have suggested a move to direct central bank financing of government spending, what George Selgin calls fiscal QE. Where do you stand on the issue of the separation of monetary and fiscal policy?
Well, I strongly believe in keeping the two separate. Of course, it's important to recognize that with monetary policy, always at least some fiscal component. You really can't do monetary policy without there being some fiscal component. For instance, print money, you earn seigniorage, so that provides tax revenue to the Treasury. Now, in an extreme case where the Fed had to do a lot of QE and perhaps buy assets as a result, there's a fiscal side of that that involves some risk to the balance sheet of the central bank. There could be losses that potentially have to be made up through fiscal policy. Recently, Congress passed a fiscal stimulus bill that provided, I think, about $150 billion in money to the Treasury to backstop losses in Fed programs during this emergency period. So you can't draw a bright line, but here's the distinction I would make between monetary and fiscal. Fiscal policy is basically about taking existing money through taxes or borrowing and moving it around to different sectors of the economy. With monetary, you're creating new money and injecting it into the economy. With fiscal spending, there's a future liability from deficits. With monetary policy, at first pass, this is a first approximation, there's no future tax liability from increasing the money supply. There's always a small risk of losses on the balance sheet, of course, but as a first approximation, fiscal policy is more costly in terms of efficiency than monetary policy. And so I would prefer to keep the two very separate, focus fiscal on just specific tasks the government needs to do for reasons other than promoting spending, and have monetary policy, the more efficient tool, focus solely on getting the right level of nominal GDP or inflation.
Yes, once you break down that institutional separation of monetary and fiscal policy, it can be very difficult to reinstitute that separation down the track. So any change there would run the risk of being permanent, I think.
Yeah, I worry about the lines being blurred. Of course, now there's an enormous push for the government to get involved in lending, and these are sort of quasi-fiscal actions. And I'm more of a purist. I would like to see monetary policy done in sort of the most neutral method possible. I don't want the government picking winners and losers, and this company will get a loan, this one won't. I would prefer that monetary policy inject money in the economy in as neutral a way as possible. Usually buying treasury bonds, going beyond that only when necessary, and then have the private sector determine where this new money will flow, have banks determine which firms will get the extra credit and so on. If for some reason there has to be subsidies to borrowing from the government, that should be done in as neutral a way as possible, not having the government choosing firms or even industries, but having some sort of general subsidy program that would apply to all borrowers on a relatively equal footing. But in general, I prefer that this be done in as clean a way as possible. Now, that's not to say there isn't a strong need for help in the economy right now. I do understand that. But when money is injected in the economy, it helps in all sorts of indirect ways. Like if the government buys treasury bonds, the people that sell those bonds to the government will then reallocate some of their funds into corporate bonds and other sectors of the economy. So there's sort of an indirect effect that comes from new money being injected in the economy. And also the sort of reflation effects. If you're in a deflationary spiral, injecting new money that raises the price level makes it easier for borrowers to pay off their debts. And that's why it's so important to keep nominal GDP growing at an adequate rate. You have to have the national income necessary to service debts. So I'd like to keep them as separate as possible and have each side do what it's best at doing.
We've seen a lot of commentators pronouncing the death of globalization in the wake of the pandemic. You have long been an advocate of the role of globalization in reducing global poverty and raising living standards. Even if you haven't changed your view on the benefits of globalization, have you at least changed your view on its prospects in the wake of the pandemic?
Not necessarily. I know that most pundits are talking about this as something that will reduce globalization in the future. I think that's really hard to predict. I did a blog post today at EconLog sort of on this topic, and I argued that the safest prediction is that in a couple of years, nothing has changed. And that's because it's hard to know how our life will change after any event of this sort. Somewhere I read that after the flu pandemic of 1918, just a year or two later, things were completely back to normal in the US and had basically been forgotten by most of the public. And that was a much more severe pandemic than what we're in now. I know after 9/11, there was a perception that it would make people less likely to want to live in New York or live in tall buildings, but exactly the opposite happened. New York boomed after 9/11, and it became very fashionable to put up 100-story apartment buildings where billionaires would live on the top floor. So I think it's hard to predict. I do believe the forces pushing globalization are so strong that it's very hard to kind of go back, even though there will doubtlessly be a number of people saying, see, we can't do this because we have to have our own supply of this or that. I do think it's very hard to point to anything very significant in the US that is worse today because of globalization. That is, any aspect of the crisis we're suffering because of globalization. We do have a little bit of a shortage of maybe masks and ventilators, but this doesn't actually seem to be due to globalization at all based on what I've read. A lot of it is due to foolish regulations, business response to the crisis, and a lot of those regulations are currently being removed. Just a couple days ago, they removed some regulations that make it very hard to import surgical masks, for instance. So when you look closely at the situation, it doesn't seem like globalization has really inhibited our ability to deal with the crisis. The logic in favor of it is so strong that even a fairly anti-free trade Trump administration made changes that I would say are sort of at the margin. You know, they redid a brand new NAFTA, but it didn't really fundamentally change the trading relationship between US, Canada, and Mexico. And I'm not even sure whether the new deals with China will fundamentally, in the long run, produce that big a change in our trading relationship with China and other developing countries. Maybe a few industries will go to Vietnam and other places as a result of the tariffs. But if the Trump administration wasn't able to decisively change the pattern of international trade, it's not clear to me that this would, after it's hopefully solved in the next few years and we go back to a more normal life.
Yes, I think
so
globalization has a logic which will compel people to try and reestablish those international linkages in the aftermath of the pandemic.
Right, it's very hard to see how we could really go back to the previous system. I believe that the Trump administration and a few of its advisors like Peter Navarro came into office with this idea that protectionist policies were actually good for the US economy. They would create jobs, they would bring back manufacturing. And after a couple of years, we kept seeing the stock market go down in response to protectionist moves, and we saw some other risk assets indicating a little bit of a risk of recession. And we had to cut interest rates sharply in 2019 during the trade war to sort of calm nerves in the financial markets that were worried about the drag of the trade war on our economy. And I think those events did impact thinking in the administration. I think there's less confidence now that we can just have a go-it-alone protectionist policy and still have robust growth, robust business investment, so on, because our economy is already so intertwined with the global economy. So many supply chains are international and so on. So there may be some trimming in trade with China for strategic reasons, but I think overall globalization is here to stay.
You have a forthcoming book on market monetarism. Could you briefly describe what the book is about and when can we expect to see it?
Well, the book is mostly written, and we're working with a publisher right now, the University of Chicago Press, to sort of finalize the document. There's a lot of work involved in these kind of books. A lot of graphs have to be drawn and so on. So I believe it'll probably come out early next year. And in the book, I guess I do two things. I try to explain the basic ideas of market monetarism as I see them, the intuition behind why monetary policy is important, how it works, why it's so central to the business cycle. And then it's also a case study of the 2008 recession, the Great Recession and the slow recovery. And in a sense, I use that recession as a way of illustrating some of the ideas behind market monetarism. So if readers or listeners have read my blog over the years, you can think of it as a way of turning my blog called The Money Illusion into a book. A lot of the ideas in the book are things that I've talked about a lot in the blog ever since I started blogging about 11 years ago.
Well, I'm certainly looking forward to reading it when it comes out, and maybe after it's been released, we can have another conversation about the contents of your book.
Unfortunately for me, it may not be perfect timing because This is a book aimed to explain almost every recession that's occurred during my lifetime, except the one we're currently in. So I'm kind of hoping that by next year, we will have somewhat of a recovery and the problem will have turned towards monetary policy and the need to ensure adequate growth in nominal GDP so that my book looks more timely. Right now, it doesn't obviously look like it has a lot to say about what's happening this month in the United States, which is definitely a real shock, not a monetary shock.
Well, I'm sure your book will stand the test of time. Thanks very much for joining us today, Scott.
Thank you for inviting me, Stephen.